The Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Carnegies, the Morgans, names that didn't just build businesses, they built America's industrial empire. Dynasties that shaped modern capitalism in ways textbooks barely touch. Families so wealthy, they literally funded wars, built cities, and controlled entire industries. But here's the truth they don't teach you in history class. Every single one of these families had zero recorded wealth before the 1850s. Not some wealth, not modest wealth, zero. John D. Rockefeller's father was a con artist who sold fake cancer cures and abandoned his family for months at a time. Cornelius Vanderbilt started with a $100 loan to buy a sailboat. Andrew Carnegie arrived in America with exactly one trunk of belongings. J.P. Morgan's grandfather was a tavern keeper in Connecticut. And it's not just these four. Every major American dynasty that exists today follows the exact same pattern. Massive generational wealth, appearing almost out of nowhere in a 30-year window. The explanation you've been given about hard work, innovation, and the American dream, that's not the full story, not even close. To understand the scale, look at the pattern. The Astors, the Carnegies, the Mellons, the Morgans, the Rockefellers, the Vanderbilts, the Guggenheims, the DuPonts, the Harrimans, the Huntingtons, these aren't just rich families. These are families that literally own America. They built the railroads, controlled oil, dominated steel production, ran the banks, and shaped government policy for over a century. Go back to 1840, check wealth records, tax documents, property holdings, and you won't find them. Not because records were lost, but because they didn't exist. Take Cornelius Vanderbilt. The Vanderbilt fortune started in 1810 when he was 16 years old. His mother loaned him $100 to buy a small sailboat to ferry passengers between Staten Island and Manhattan. That was it, $100 and a sailboat. By 1877, when he died, he was worth over $100 million. That's over $200 billion in today's money. From a $100 loan to the richest man in America in 67 years. But the Vanderbilt story isn't unique. It's the template. Every dynasty follows the same arc: poverty or modest means before 1850. Explosive, almost incomprehensible wealth by 1880. And that 30-year timeline isn't a coincidence. The official story says industrialization created opportunities. Railroads, steel, oil, banking. Visionaries seized them. Hard work, innovation, risk-taking, the American dream in action. Partially true, but incomplete. Industrialization happened in England, France, Germany too, but those countries didn't produce dozens of families with Vanderbilt-level wealth in a single generation. Europe had old money, aristocracy, entrenched systems. In America, wealth didn't transfer from old aristocrats to industrialists. There were no old aristocrats. The wealth appeared out of thin air, and the mechanism wasn't just hard work or innovation, it was far more deliberate. Railroads are where the story truly begins. In 1850, America had about 9,000 miles of track. By 1880, that number exploded to over 93,000 miles, the largest infrastructure project in human history up to that point. Every mile was built with government land grants, subsidies, and government-backed bonds. The Pacific Railway Acts of 1862 and 1864 handed companies like Union Pacific and Central Pacific over 170 million acres of public land for free, an area larger than Texas. Loans worth tens of millions at below-market interest rates followed. Vanderbilt didn't just compete in a free market with his own money. He bought politicians, bribed legislators, manipulated stock prices, controlled shipping rates through backroom deals. His wealth came from monopoly power, guaranteed by the state, not innovation. Leland Stanford, one of the Central Pacific's Big Four, simultaneously served as governor of California while his company received massive federal land grants. That wasn't a conflict of interest, it was open corruption. He literally wrote laws that funded his own railroad. When workers protested unsafe conditions or demanded fair wages, he used state militia to crush strikes. The official story says the railroad barons connected America, built infrastructure, and made the country a superpower. True, but they did it by extracting wealth from the government, exploiting immigrant labor, and wielding political power to eliminate competition. The free market had little to do with it. Now, let's turn to oil. The Rockefeller story is even more revealing. John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in 1870. Within 10 years, he controlled 90% of America's oil refining capacity, 90%. That wasn't innovation, that was monopoly. And the way he built that monopoly wasn't through better products or lower prices, it was through a strategy called railroad rebates. Rockefeller made secret deals with railroad companies. He shipped massive quantities of oil on their trains, and in exchange, they gave him rebates, not just discounts on his shipments, but rebates on his competitors' shipments as well. Every time a rival company shipped a barrel of oil, Rockefeller got paid. Competitors were literally funding his empire without knowing it. It was illegal, violating common carrier laws, but Rockefeller had enough political power that the laws weren't enforced. And when states tried to intervene, he simply restructured Standard Oil as a trust, creating a loophole to operate across state lines without oversight. By 1880, Rockefeller was worth hundreds of millions, not by drilling more oil or refining it better, but by manipulating the system, crushing competition, and using political connections to avoid regulation. The invisible hand of the free market didn't create his wealth. The very visible hand of government did. Banking followed the same pattern. J.P. Morgan didn't start as a banker. His grandfather owned a tavern in Connecticut. His father became a merchant banker in London, but the family wasn't wealthy by aristocratic standards. Morgan's real fortune came from a single deal in 1879, when he helped the U.S. government sell bonds to refinance Civil War debt. He made millions in fees, and once he had that capital, he began buying railroads, steel companies, and industrial firms. By 1900, Morgan controlled U.S. Steel, General Electric, and half a dozen major railroads. He was so powerful that during the financial crisis of 1907, the government asked him to bail out the economy. Think about that the government went to a private banker for rescue. He did it because he had more liquid capital than the Treasury. Morgan didn't create value, he consolidated power, merged struggling companies into monopolies, and used them to extract wealth, with government not only allowing but encouraging it. Andrew Carnegie followed a similar playbook in steel. He undercut competitors by manipulating freight rates through railroad deals, crushed labor unions with state militias, and when he sold Carnegie Steel to J.P. Morgan in 1901 for $480 million, he became the richest man in the world overnight. Carnegie didn't invent steel or revolutionize manufacturing. He controlled the supply chain, eliminated competition, and leveraged political power to maintain monopoly. The Bessemer process that allowed cheap steel came from England. Carnegie simply applied it in America, where labor was cheaper and regulation weaker. So, why did this happen only in America? England, France, Germany had existing power structures, aristocratic families, established monopolies, strong labor movements. In England, building a railroad meant negotiating with landowners with legal titles going back centuries. In America, the government seized land from Native Americans and handed it to railroad companies for free. Europe had stronger regulations, banking laws, labor protections, and antitrust frameworks. America had none until the early 1900s. The Gilded Age was called the Gilded Age. For a reason it looked golden, but beneath the surface was corruption, exploitation, and unprecedented wealth extraction. These families didn't just get rich, they built dynasties that still control large portions of the American economy today. The Rockefellers manage billions through trusts and foundations. The Morgans evolved into J.P. Morgan Chase. The Vanderbilts' fortune diluted over generations, but the name still carries weight in business and politics. They weren't self-made men pulling themselves up by bootstraps. They were opportunists, exploiting a historical moment when the government handed out land, subsidies, and monopoly power. Once they had control, they used it to rewrite rules in their favor. The myths about rags to riches and philanthropy obscure the true mechanisms of their wealth. Carnegie built libraries, yes, but he earned that fortune, paying steel workers starvation wages and using Pinkertons to shoot strikers. Rockefeller donated millions to universities and medical research, but he made that money by destroying competitors and manipulating markets. Intelligence and hard work helped, but systems created billion-dollar fortunes. The system in America, between 1850 and 1880, transferred public wealth into private hands at unprecedented speed. Land grants alone moved over 200 million acres of public land, 10% of the entire United States, to private railroad companies. Imagine if that happened today, 10% of America handed to Jeff Bezos to build infrastructure. People would riot. But in the 1800s, it happened, and we celebrate the men who took the land as visionaries. The question isn't whether they were smart. The question is whether we can recognize that the opportunity shouldn't have existed in the first place. But railroads and oil were just the surface. The deeper wealth extraction came through more sophisticated mechanisms still relevant today. Currency and credit manipulation played a major role. Before the Civil War, America lacked a unified currency. Banks printed their own money. Thousands of different banknotes circulated, their value fluctuating based on the bank's reputation. Chaos for commerce, but opportunity for those who understood the system. The National Banking Acts of 1863 and 1864 changed everything. They created a unified national currency backed by government bonds. Critically, the only way to obtain this currency was to first buy government bonds. Those with capital could buy bonds, deposit them with the Treasury, and receive national banknotes worth 90% of the bond value, effectively printing money backed by government debt. J.P. Morgan's father, Junius Spencer Morgan, understood this early. He bought massive quantities of Union bonds during the Civil War, when they were deeply discounted, betting on a Northern victory. When the North won, those bonds skyrocketed in value. Junius Morgan made millions, and his son, J.P. Morgan, used that capital to dominate banking in America. Other families followed similar paths. D.J. Cook built a banking empire selling Union bonds to European investors during the Civil War, personally financing the Northern Pacific Railway after the war. When that railroad project collapsed in 1873, triggering the Panic of 1873, thousands of businesses went bankrupt, unemployment reached 14%. But the families with real power didn't lose. They profited because crises allowed them to buy assets at fire sale prices. J.P. Morgan acquired railroads and industrial companies for pennies on the dollar. Rockefellers expanded Standard Oil by buying bankrupt refineries. Carnegie bought struggling steel mills and consolidated them into his empire. The pattern repeats. Create a boom with government subsidies and easy credit, let smaller players overextend, trigger a crash, buy everything at a discount, consolidate power, or repeat. Those who understood this pattern thrived, leveraging political connections to shape recovery in their favor. Military contracts were another key mechanism. The DuPont family, for example, arrived from France in 1800 with almost nothing. They started a gunpowder mill in Delaware in 1802. For decades, business was modest. Then came the Civil War. The Union Army needed gunpowder, lots of it. DuPont became the primary supplier, making millions. After the war, they diversified into chemicals, explosives, and eventually synthetic materials like nylon. Core wealth came from military contracts. World War I, World War II, the Cold War. They didn't wait passively, they lobbied for military spending, funded politicians, and shaped foreign policy to create demand for their products. The DuPonts were the military-industrial complex before Eisenhower ever warned of it. Other families followed similar paths. Guggenheim's in mining and smelting, Mellon's building Gulf Oil and Alcoa. These families profited from wars, shaping policy to sustain demand. Some even conducted business with America's enemies. During World War II, companies like Standard Oil and Chase Bank had financial ties to Nazi Germany. Profit outweighed ideology, and after the war, their power shielded them from consequences. Wealth consolidation extended to real estate. John Jacob Astor arrived in America in 1784 with nothing, became a fur trader, then made massive fortunes through real estate speculation. Astor bought land in Manhattan when it was still farmland, often with insider knowledge from government officials about city expansion plans. When the Erie Canal opened in 1825, land values along the route skyrocketed. Astor owned much of it, reinvested profits into more land, and by his death in 1848, he was America's richest man, with over $20 million equivalent to over $600 million today. He created wealth not by building value, but by waiting for the government to build infrastructure nearby, a classic case of rent-seeking. This model repeats across cities. San Francisco's Big Four railroad barons bought land along planned routes before announcements. Chicago's meatpacking barons controlled stockyards, railroads, and labor, exploiting workers and consumers. Wealth was built through deliberate manipulation of policy, labor exploitation, and monopoly consolidation. Finally, dynastic preservation ensured that wealth endured. Trusts allowed families to transfer assets across generations without taxes or dilution. The Rockefellers pioneered this with the Standard Oil Trust in 1882. Trusts enabled centralized control, letting families act as unified entities across generations. Rockefeller wealth didn't dilute upon his death. In 1937, it stayed in trusts, growing and funding political causes, shaping policy, and maintaining influence. The Mellons followed similar strategies, with Andrew Mellon using his position as Treasury Secretary to cut taxes on the wealthy and deregulate markets, directly benefiting family businesses. Wealth, political influence, and cultural power became self-perpetuating. The myths we tell obscure the truth. We celebrate philanthropy without examining its origins, admire business acumen without acknowledging monopolies, and teach the American dream while ignoring land grants, subsidies, and political corruption. The wealthiest families didn't earn their fortunes in a free market. They extracted it through a system designed to funnel public resources into private hands. They rewrote rules to prevent others from replicating their success. Antitrust laws like the Sherman Act of 1890 were rarely enforced. When Standard Oil was broken up in 1911, the Rockefellers profited by owning shares in all the resulting companies. This performative regulation preserved dynastic wealth. Today, the descendants of these families continue to shape policy through lobbying, campaign finance, and think tanks. Wealth begets power. Power protects wealth. The cycle endures. Every family controlling America today had no recorded wealth before the 1850s. Their fortunes weren't created by markets. They were extracted through monopoly, political corruption, and government subsidies on a scale the world had never seen. That's not the American dream. That's the American reality.